we're building all these product capabilities and, controls for our customers, but how should they think about sovereignty?
That's like the $1 million question, right? $10 billion?
I thought we discussed it was $10 billion.
Yeah, $10 billion.
Right.
The Shift, Agentic Edition, connects the people building AI tools with those creating agents so we can all level up together. Today, we're taking a beat with the Microsoft Azure team, Evelyn, Edouard, Mina, and Kareem, about an open question we heard from you. How do we draw agentic borders?
I actually think it's really interesting because from a Microsoft standpoint, we define digital sovereignty in a way where it's talking about like the capability to participate in the digital economy securely, independently, and with self-determined controls. And I'm like, what does that mean? And I think we try to kind of think about positioning it more so around it's not isolation. It's not about autarky, right? So participating in the digital economy really means that, we operate globally. We have to work with partners all over the world. We have our operations all over the world. So
I just came back from Mobile World Congress this week, and what I really experienced is that sovereignty is not like a predefined one thing. It meant different things for different people that we spoke with. And it almost felt like a spectrum. On one end, one of the partners that I met with was kind of trying to define this concept of sovereign enough for them to be able to meet the regulatory needs, the compliance, and build an economically viable solution for their end users. And then fast forward in that spectrum, on the other end, it was all about, in-country, their infrastructure, their hardware, building their own AI model, confidential compute, like everybody's talking about sovereignty in their own way. So obviously the sovereignty for a national security customer is different from how a retailer looks about sovereignty.
And it's usually once you start that conversation that you discover actually that, okay, what is really the trade-off that they're ready to take? What do they really need in their workload? And that type of conversation comes if you spend enough time with the customer and spend enough time to try to understand and even help them discover what is their real need in that process. But it's never an easy conversation.
Yeah. I think most of the time when I meet customers, their conversation often steers towards like, show me where the cliff is. Like, when will your solution stop working, or when will I not have capabilities? Versus my job is to make sure there is actually no cliff. You can actually have a successful journey without ever having to hit that cliff. Rather than jumping to the solution, let's understand what the problem is and how we can jointly solve that problem.
I think that's a great point, because I think what we've been seeing is that digital sovereignty is a very emotive topic, right? It's very emotional. And so I think as humans, our first thing to do is go to worst case scenario, as you just said, Edouard. It's what's the worst thing that could happen and how do I prepare that for myself versus, let's be a little bit more practical and kind of figure out, when we're thinking about sovereignty, we should be thinking about what amount of, which workloads, right?
The emotional part is interesting. The thing that I would say is, with all the innovation that's going on, everyone talking about AI and wanting to get involved, people really feel compelled to use more technology than they ever have in new, novel ways. But our world is now as or more uncertain than it's ever been. And so when you combine those two things, the discussion of sovereignty or digital sovereignty is what we need to do to build confidence to operate in that digital economy.
Yeah, and I also think that there's some kind of confusion as well, which is around sovereignty versus security versus there's aspects of sovereignty that are focused on data residency. And I think sometimes that all gets conflated into one bucket of sovereignty.
Yes, to the point we discussed before, that everyone has their own definition. The most obvious would be data residency, and that's the definition of sovereignty for most. But actually, when you dig, it's not always the case. And it started that way because of GDPR, because of the European data boundaries, and so on. We see requests coming from Asia and Latin America and Central America and so on and so forth. And in those regions, it might not be always the data residency. Sovereignty will mean different things depending on where you are and what type of business and what type of workload you're operating.
Yeah, I just want to build on top of what Edward said. Like, in addition to like data residency, the most concern we hear from customers are related to business continuity. Like, no matter what happens, they want to ensure their critical infrastructure in the line of business that they serve continues to operate without impacting their end users and their business. Majority of customers define sovereignty as business continuity. The end goal for them is to ensure that critical infrastructure keeps running. Now, we were talking about this earlier. It's like, what is the insurance that we're willing to pay to ensure that their critical infrastructure is running?
So that's like resonates super strongly. Like when we built up the Microsoft Cloud, the things that are like Office, Microsoft 365, and Azure, the apps and services that we build that go and span all these regions of the world, we look at failure modes. We think, as engineers, what are all the combinations of things that could go wrong, and we gradually have been fixing and addressing all those concerns. And every once in a while there'll be something we miss, and we say, okay, great, we need to go and address some concern. But more and more, losing one or even many pieces of all these interconnected systems doesn't break our customers, doesn't cause outages to the global fabric, so that the failures stay isolated.
And honestly, some of the requirements that are now bubbling up due to sovereignty and all the geopolitical aspects and the fact that it's central to most of the conversations today, some of those requirements are legit, actually bring the industry forward. It helps us to get better and, making sure that we provide the right level of controls to customers and the right level of audit. And so it's actually a pretty positive turn on that front. Whether it would have happened outside of that geopolitical context, probably.
As you were talking about the changing governance and regulations, almost like every day we're hearing about like a new law, new country coming up with some requirements. I can't keep re-architecting my workload to meet Act A and Act B and Act C. Like, I need to make sure that I build something that is more sustainable and scalable over time. And I need to have those controls at every level of my technology stack so that I'm well protected against all these changing requirements. They want to be able to take advantage of all these capabilities to innovate and participate in the digital economy, of like shielding themselves to make pace with that innovation while kind of, remaining protected. As we talk about all these national policies, now we're starting to hear a lot of countries mandate using their nationally developed generative AI, large language models, and then they want to govern who gets access to it. It's like, how do they ensure that that data remains within the country's jurisdiction, especially with capacity constraints in global regions and kind of partnering with neoclouds for capacity. They're concerned that they might not be able to protect their data, either at rest or during training or during transit.
How are we, from an engineering perspective, kind of building out different features or like keeping sovereignty in mind?
I could speak to a couple of the layers and the ways we think about it. Confidential compute is a piece of it. That's data in use being protected through confidential compute. A big part of it as well is the data at rest. Like, what happens for that data if it exists in another place, and how you do it. So encryption at rest, and then management of who accesses the keys, or how those keys exist to protect and encrypt that data is like a secondary way to think about it. And the way I would say it is, every time you use layers of encryption or layers of protection, you make the data, you make the processing opaque to the operator, or you make it opaque to someone else. So if you control the keys to your data, that data is yours, and it's effectively in your virtual national boundary. And so, when you're training on large data sets, if you're going to process that data outside a boundary, then confidential compute comes in from a processing in-use place. But if the data exists outside the boundary at rest, then you're going to encrypt it And, you'll definitely want to have someone, intermediating the keys or an operator's access to the keys of that data. And then that gives you a much higher degree of control of that content. You can define all these sort of layers of keys and protection, but even then, there's more isolation warranted or needed by those classification models. And that's where, the local stuff comes in to go and protect that. And I guess a question I have then is, are people using local for training? Are they doing local training in data? And how do you think about that with things like Foundry Local and other AI models being brought locally?
The majority of the use cases we see with Azure Local is often with inferencing, because that's more versatile and affordable for a lot of customers to be able to quickly,
hundreds of millions of euros of
exactly.
GPUs.
You just need enterprise grade servers, and you can stand up with existing, data center infrastructure. You don't need like fancy power requirements and water cooled InfiniBand racks to be rolled in. So the cost to get started is much faster in the inferencing side. We're starting to see customers looking into fine-tuning models because they want to be able to cater to their industry or their clientele. And so tuning the models is becoming more of a pattern that we see that requires slightly more powerful GPUs.
But doing that locally as well.
But doing it locally.
Yeah.
Training models at the edge is a very expensive proposition.
Sure.
That I don't think anybody has solved the mathematical equation to say that this is going to be an economically viable solution where I can amortize the capex of putting these very high-powered, expensive infrastructure and be able to reap the capex of that infrastructure at the edge.
The data, build models on top of the data with massive amounts of compute, and then you do that at some interval. And so between those intervals, that hardware needs to get used for something, or it will sit idle or fallow.
And to a point earlier on the trade-offs, if you actually, we do have alternate solution that allows for training to happen in a given region, or where you have some level of control of where your training happens, that is in our data center with Azure Local, or is it acceptable to have that level of training happening in the region? And usually,
there are some national partner clouds that, not Microsoft, but partners, that customers of other countries are trying to figure out how they can do one themselves. But the way they think about, amortizing the investment is to be able to bring on more startups and bring more models into the ecosystem so that they are trying to keep that inventory fresh and running and utilized, rather than like, okay, I build out like 2 models a year, and then what am I doing with all that infrastructure?
That's amazing. I think the thing that we know, and we certainly have observed the last couple of years, is demand far exceeds supply for the compute infrastructure, for GPUs or GPU racks, and in fact for power, for all of those things. And so, we're in this place where I think everyone is very motivated to maximize what they're getting out of their investments. The question is, how many places can make the scale of investments or have the resiliency of investments needed to deal with those sovereign concerns?
You're in deep thoughts, Evelyn.
I know, I was like, yes. I mean, I don't know if this is kind of forking a little bit, but you just touched on national partner clouds. But when is it that folks are really leaning into private cloud? Is it more just for business continuity, as you mentioned earlier, or is it a safeguard? Is it that insurance, or what are the different scenarios that you're seeing?
So often we see the same customer kind of picking a spectrum of solutions for them, depending on their workload needs and the workload classification. It's not that one customer picks one solution, like the sovereign public cloud, and that is it for them. So we see some workloads that can sustain an extended period of disconnectivity, and their function doesn't suffer as much, or the intellectual property is not as highly classified. And so they're very much within the realms of their compliance to take advantage of the sovereign public cloud.
Can you give an example of like a disconnected or something disconnected? Like, what's a use case?
So if they do a good business continuity backup solution in region where they have multiple regions for backup, and if they lose connectivity to one region, they're able to fall back to another region. And so their workload might have some level of slowness, depending on the traffic all being routed to one location and how they have done load balancing and scalability in the region.
I thought you were going to say, I was going to say the other way, which are solutions designed to run in a disconnected way for extended periods. Yeah.
So this is like for the public cloud,
Got it.
Then there are, workloads that cannot sustain any disconnectivity and they have to run at the edge.
That word,
What?
disconnectivity.
Yeah, is that a word?
I don't know. The wrong person to ask, but I love it. You may have said it first.
Okay, I'm going to trademark it.
Yeah.
There are workloads that can sustain a certain amount of disconnectivity that are running on premises. And, what happens is customers can still access the infrastructure, the virtual machines and containers that are running on the infrastructure keeps running, but you just don't have access to the control plane APIs to make any kind of mutating changes on them. And so, in a matter of a few days, you can restore connectivity, and things will just keep running as though nothing happened. But then there are highly sensitive workloads that just cannot sustain any disconnectivity.
But why is that? Like I've worked on SaaS solutions in our cloud and the hyperscale things, and there's always some threshold where these big applications we've built need to be connected to some other part of those systems that make up what they are.
Think about like the submarine scenario.
Perfect.
Or
I was hoping you'd go for something like that. Yeah.
So often, like once every 6 months, they come offshore and catch air, and then maybe can take an update, and then after that,
they're offline again for some period.
For like extended period of time. So it's not a matter of like days. Like you need to be able to access that infrastructure over an extended period of time.
Right.
And so running a completely disconnected operation becomes paramount for those type of scenarios. And the way we've built the technology is that you're not coming up for air to give a heartbeat. You're just someone's giving you the bits from the cloud so you can just go back down.
Download as fast as you can and move on.
Yeah. So our Azure local disconnected operations was built for the submarine scenarios where you have an extended period of time where there's just no connectivity at all. But then as we have progressed into these sovereign conversations in the past few months, we see customers wanting to have the optionality to have a local control plane as a failover mechanism. They want to ensure that if I lose access to the public cloud, I want to make sure that my data and my workload can fail over and run from my local cloud without having to take a dependency with the public cloud or connectivity concerns. And so the sovereign private cloud with disconnected operation is becoming more and more of a meaningful alternative for customers to ensure that critical infrastructure that they need is available for them.
Makes sense.
Are there security trade-offs when you have a disconnected operation?
Well, every technology we build at Microsoft, we build based on security as the primary pillar.
One thing, yeah.
So we build security at every layer of our infrastructure. It comes with secure boot. It has trusted VM with guest attestation. We're investing in bringing confidential compute as well, both for VMs and GPUs. All of the Azure's security and governance policies are brought in as part of our Azure local solution, even in the disconnected operations. But it's a limited set of Azure services that we are bringing to the edge and be able to run with the local control plane. But the goodness here is the consistency of those services. The Azure portal, the same APIs and PowerShell commands. So customers don't have to learn a new technology.
This is the point that comes across in the customer conversations. Like you mentioned before, that most of the customer doesn't go for public or for private, and usually it's kind of a mix of both.
Yeah.
And so being able to manage their workloads depending on their requirements consistently with the same technology across public and private is what lead them usually to pick that architecture. So
Yeah, this is a common question that we get asked by customers. How is the lifecycle management within Azure Local disconnected. And the first surprising response that they hear is it's always disconnected. It never has to send a heartbeat back to the public
it's
cloud.
like the diametric opposite
Yeah.
of the cloud that I work on, which is, how many hundreds of thousands of updates every single day. But we actually count on our ability to go as fast as possible with safety to get updates and features and innovation and experiments to that cloud. And so while the resiliency concern is absolutely top of mind for us, I need to go really, really fast. And I need features deployed or fixes out
In minutes.
in minutes worldwide.
Yeah.
And so the amount of work and the kind of work that you have to do to have a solution like that be both secure, to your point, but also, stable and resilient, you may not get another chance for 6 months to fix those issues.
So with Azure Local, whether connected or disconnected, in both cases, we actually push out updates every month.
Yeah.
So every month, customers have an opportunity to get access to those
Air and then download the bits.
security patches, updates, and features. Depending on the cadence in which we push updates.
The submarine analogy is amazing. It's super helpful to think through resilience concerns, operational concerns. But I'm curious what the equivalent or what a different, what metaphor would you use to talk about our public cloud and how customers are
going to be as perfect, but basically, if you look at the constraint, a lot of our customers are in regulated industries in the public cloud. And so if you look at a bank, they have tons of constraints. They want to run their workload. They usually have a lot of regulatory constraints that they have to comply with.
Like what? What's an example?
Like local regulation and making sure that they comply with the standard financial regulation in their country. And so that
one example of that would be PII information, your citizen, your clientele, personal identifiable information, purchase matter.
Stored in a way or...
who has access to it.
Got it.
Yeah.
So here you want to make sure that basically your data stays in the country, that they are encrypted if necessary. And so that's where confidential computing is useful to them. But now more and more, you can throw actually AI in the mix and extrapolate some of your results and manage some of your risk through AI. And the way you control where your data is processed, where your model is trained. So it's always deployed, usually in a very secure environment, and sometimes with Azure Local as well. So even though it's not a submarine, they also are interested into having that disconnected operation capabilities for continuity purposes. You would have the local AI.
Some of the isolation pieces,
piece. And you would have also the no operator control or no operator access. So you basically control who has access to your data when, and you're fully in control of your data environment.
When you talk to customers about their concerns, and obviously part of what you do is you're trying to elicit a set of questions from them, what are the last few conversations that you had like?
The risk scenario is a very good one. So it's how can I leverage AI without going into crazy investments because I don't have the bandwidth or the
5 megawatts of power.
So I still want to benefit from the power of the public cloud. But at the same time, I want to keep that control over my IP. And so I want to protect that.
And maybe I'll kind of ask a slightly different question. I mean, we're building all these product capabilities and controls for our customers, but how should they think about sovereignty?
That's the $1 million question, right? $10 billion.
I thought we discussed it was $10 billion.
$10 billion.
Right. Even more than that, I think.
I mean, there are definitely optionalities that we're investing in, but how does customer decide when to choose one? Especially when our customers are global customers, and so how does our solution scale by region, by country?
Right now, we offer the sovereign public cloud. Anyone can kind of leverage the sovereign controls and features that we offer in the public cloud in which they already operate, right? So, we have 70 plus data center regions operating across, what is it now, 400 plus data centers. Then you kind of layer on the sovereign private cloud, which gives them kind of that flexibility to not just have the sovereign public cloud, but they can kind of operate hybrid or disconnected, as we just talked about in terms of disconnected operations. I think right now, a lot of our focus has been around Europe, right? So we've got the European Union and EFTA, which is European Free Trade Association. It's been really easy for us to kind of think about how do we tackle a large market that has harmonized regulations, and it's much easier for us to kind of address sovereignty in a big area there. Our next challenge as we think about it is, how do we bring that out globally? Already we've made announcements in India, we've made announcements in Canada. Then you go into Asia and you have to kind of pick things out in different countries based on whatever their regulations are, what their requirements are, what exactly they're needing. And so, we're kind of partnering around the contractual and legal assurances as well, right? I think now we're just trying to expand that out as we go around the globe.
So, we have a number of public clouds locations where customers can take advantage of sovereign controls we're investing in. But then we're aware that we don't have region in every country or every location, jurisdiction. And for that, we have sovereign private cloud where customers can deploy on premises and then choose to connect to a public cloud for the control plane if that is within their jurisdiction boundary, or can have a locally deployed control plane with Azure Local disconnected and take advantage of the Azure goodness, Azure consistency while running on premises and meeting all the regulatory needs. Like this is a pretty broad range of customer cohorts that we talk with. Absolutely.
There are many, many capabilities that we continue to build by talking to customers in particular industries and for particular concerns that turn out to be amazing ways to go and solve for the next set of problems that come up. And so, I'm bullish that even if we don't know exactly what the world looks like, we're building towards whatever might be coming our direction and might be coming the way of our vast customer base. And so
Karim, I would just add to that. Most of everything that was built in the first place was built for public sector and regulated industries.
Sure.
And now basically every customer, no matter their industry, cares about sovereignty. And so all those features that were usually limited to very specific industries are now kind of mainstream.
One of the investments we're making with Sovereign Private Cloud is bringing sovereignty AI to the edge as well. And what that means is we're bringing some of the goodness of our Foundry, Microsoft Foundry capabilities to the edge. Satya talked about Foundry Local on Azure Local, where we are bringing access to the thousands and thousands of open source models that can be deployed at the edge, so customers don't have to, build their own models, but can take advantage of global models that are available. With Foundry Local, we're also extending to bring more agentic AI capabilities at the edge with all the IQ workflows that now is available in public cloud will soon become available in private cloud as well, both in connected as well as disconnected. So this really helps customers get a jump start in their AI innovation, particularly as we have pivoted to investing in more of the agentic capabilities that customers want to build.
While still offering that continuity between public and private.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Check out the link below to get our latest white paper. See you next time.